Today we are going to do a tune comparison between a stock GT350 and a stock Mustang. It is the Voodoo versus Coyote tune comparison. Stick around. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the garage, and today we're kicking off a new series here on the channel where we look at some stock tunes. Sometimes we might do some comparisons to similar platforms, maybe what a 6.2 Silverado looks like versus a Corvette or a Camaro, things like that. In this case, we're going to compare the tunes between the GT350 with the Voodoo and the Mustang GT with the Coyote. Now keep in mind that they are two different engines built on similar platforms. The Voodoo is just kind of a pumped up Coyote. It has the flat plane crank. It has a little bit more displacement in it. It's a 5.2 versus a 5 liter. So there's going to be some obvious differences in here, but I think it might be interested to go into it and actually see what outside of just standard airflow calculations and torque stuff is actually different. So we're going to dive right in. Let's open her up here, get it up on the screen, and we have the GT as our primary file on our GT350. And first things first, let's take a look at the comparison log and see how much stuff is actually different between these two. And obviously engine displacement is, but you can see there's a lot going on. And we get down into speed density, all of the different volumetric efficiency tables or speed density tables on the Mustangs that they're popular for. All of these are different. A lot of stuff going on there. Some stuff on the electronic throttle that's different. If I'm not mistaken, does the Voodoo not use dual throttle bodies versus one? We'll look into that. And of course, variable camshaft differences because there's going to be more aggressive cam on the Voodoo. Injector differences because we probably have higher flowing injectors on there. And then of course we got some spark differences, lots and lots and lots. And then of course the torque models, there's going to be a lot of differences there, not surprised. So very interesting. We're just going to kind of run through the gamut here, take a look. Obviously our engine displacement, we've got a 1.6 pounds. That's an interesting displacement. Grams, milligrams, I don't know why they wouldn't use cubic inches or liters, but apparently they're using pounds on these. And then let's look into idle. We've got some tables here that are present on one and not the other. So the GT has these grayed out tables. The GT350 looks to not have them. So even though they are the same controller, these are both the TC1791 controllers, but it just goes to show that different revisions of software between different controllers are the same controller, aka the operating system is going to have different parameters enabled underneath there. So we definitely get into some different stuff pretty quick, and it's just small adjustments between idle, startup times and set points, not big stuff there, but we should see some decent changes on here. And so we've got more airflow from the looks of it on the GT350 than we do on the GT. Not surprised. That motor should be breathing more. And then, of course, we've got the torque reserves. Expect those to be higher. They are, that's all standard stuff that we see whenever we go from a less powerful motor to a more powerful motor. We kick over to airflow. Our big one that we want to check out is the mass airflow calibration. We're getting up to, let's change this over to pounds per hour. So we're getting up to 1743, and they max out at the same place, but as you notice, it maxes out at a lower voltage on here. 425 on the GT350, where it has to go all the way up to, well, I guess it goes up to 425 there, and it just flat lines out. That's interesting. So the tables do not match. If you look over here on our rows, we have a little more resolution on there, and they start out both at 21 and they go up. The curves probably actually look familiar, are the same. Yeah, there's no difference between the curves. That's very interesting, and this makes sense in a way because what we're looking at here is that the intake ducting on the GT versus the GT350 is the same size, and so the volume of air that it can register versus voltage would be the same there. Theoretically, these two tables are going to be the same. But here's something that's very interesting on the Mustang. So we've got a bunch of zeros to start off, and then we go to 4.5. On the GT350, we go from 0 straight to 0.5, then we go down to 4.5. So these tables don't match up one for one there, but if we come in here and let's take 0.9 at 46.9, we're at 46.9 here. So they are effectively the same curve. The units are the column axis, row axis here are just different. And in fact, you could copy one over from the other and it would be the same. But as I said, that makes sense because mass airflow is a calculation based on the diameter of your MAF. And so that's one of those things whenever somebody asks, oh, I'm maxing out my mass airflow sensor. If you go to a bigger intake duct, that will give you more room for calculation, because what you end up getting there is then that you have a lower, in this case on a GM or something, we use frequency, but in this case it uses volts, where you might be at this point at 267, you're at 2.1 volts. Whenever you go to the lower one, then suddenly you're creating 267 at say 1.4 volts, and it gives you a lot more voltage headroom or frequency headroom down the road there. So speed density, obviously we're not going to really touch on this because of the way that the Mustangs are set up, the Ford platform is set up. We can open up the speed density calculator, but we can't look at the tables per se. Let me open up another editor here, and we could just do this. GT350, open up another window, because there's no way of doing a comparison one-to-one on these volumetric efficiency editors, but we can look at it this way. And if we come in here and do speed density calculator, take a look at, we'll just look at map 0.0 and compare these two, and yeah, there's differences. This is a little smoother looking table on the GT. The GT350 has some weird spikes. I'm not sure if that's an accurate spike in there. Map 0.1 looks better on the GT350 compared to the GT is pretty smooth. And I'm guessing that there is some cam stuff going on here that's present on the Voodoo as opposed to the Coyote, where there might be some dips in there. If you have any insight on that, let me know down below. And obviously we're not using all of these points, so don't get too caught up on some of these looking ugly, but let's see if we scroll down through this one if it's got some ugly ones. See, the GT's got a lot cleaner just across the board. There's some ugly stuff in there, but that's what happens whenever you break out all of this stuff into multiple tables as opposed to using coefficients. It kind of does the same way, just differently. It is, you know, blending multiple where we have zones on a GM platform and we're using polynomial math to create the curves and stuff like this. We have kind of the same thing where we've got different points that can then intersect to create different graphs, things like that. But let's get back into it. Look at electronic throttle. And somebody remind me, is it only specific GT350s that had dual throttle bodies? Maybe I'm thinking of something else that did. Maybe the GT350s, the Voodoos, were always just a single throttle body, but a little more aggressive range on the TPS. We're going to 6 to 12 versus 6.5 to 11.5, and that's probably just because it's a bigger throttle body. If we were to go through in here, max throttle angle, yeah, you can go 92%. So just a bigger throttle body from the looks of it. Probably something like an 85 to a 92 millimeter throttle body. Nothing crazy. Check the variable camshaft. We'll see a lot of different stuff on here. And let's go straight into the banks and look at the degrees on these, the phasing, and pretty aggressive shift from the looks at it. We're looking, I mean, we've got something pretty aggressive down there. If we go out on the top end, it's maybe a little less. Let's use the difference. So we've got more phasing degrees per second and then less down on the bottom side. So there is a decent swing on that. That's pretty interesting. Kind of be expected. As I said, we're talking about two different cam profiles on effectively the same motor, but on top of that, you know, something that I'm always interested in is, I want to go back to general real quick. System, maybe. Vehicle mass. 39, 36, so about 100 pounds difference. Where's the firing order changed? Because it can't have the same firing order on this thing. Very interesting. Firing order versus cylinder. Found it. Never mind. Yep, there it is. There's the big shift right there. So, normal V8 crank, flat plane crank. Okay, never mind. Cool. Always wondered that. That's one of those small things that was always like, I wonder what's going on there. We can come in here and, oh man, MBT tables. More timing. I'm surprised down low there's more timing. Up top, I'm not surprised that there may be a little less timing. That's weird. Like, it's less in a couple rows than it's more in a couple. But, okay, that's part of it. The engine, the columns are in a different separation, much like the mass airflow sensor. And that's because the Voodoo goes up above 7,000 RPM. So that makes sense that they've got the same resolution on the table. They've got to kind of compress it down, and in order to make room for the 8,000 RPM limit down there. So we're getting some interpolation wrong. If these tables were to match up, we would probably see a more consistent. You wouldn't see these spikes of one's higher, one's lower, one's higher, one's lower. Okay, a little more aggressive knock retard on the GT350. That makes sense. I wonder if the knock sensors are a little bit more aggressive too. They are. Well, not everywhere. They seem to be tuned a little bit differently. This would also make sense though because of the firing order. This isn't necessarily a 1-for-1. It should be on cylinder 1. If we go back to our firing order, we stay the same for the most part until the last 4, and so you would think that if it had the same resonance through the block that these would be pretty close, but obviously there's other modifications that are going on. The headers are different on these things if I'm not mistaken, so they're a little bit better header, but in turn they're probably a little bit more sensitive to knock in different ways. And in turn, we would see a shift in the frequencies on here. That makes sense. Frequency, this is the actual frequency that you're reading from the sensor itself. It's kind of cool that the boards have this table. And based on kind of like your firing order and your displacement's a big one. How are your bore of your cylinder is a big one that determines what your frequency. So the bigger the bore is, the lower the frequency is going to be. And is the GT350 bored out compared to it? Is the stroke length the same? Let's see what Car and Driver has to say about it. 5.2, flat plane crank. Block, reinforcing, same bore spacing and deck height. But the 94 by 93 millimeter board stroke gets you out to 315. So Voodoo does have a larger bore. Okay, that makes sense. And that lines up with what we're seeing here, where we've got lower frequencies on our knock table because larger bores create a lower noise, lower frequency noise. Cool stuff. Okay, torque model. Ugh, look at this stuff. Let's go in. We can look at our torque inverse calculator. And we'll do the same thing. We'll open this one up over here so we can kind of see what the torque models are compared to. And you've got to remember that on torque models in particular, it's not necessarily indication that this is the torque output. So we're actually looking at the GT here on engine torque 0 and at 6750 we're at 547, whereas we're only up to about 480 on here. Couple things could be going on there. One of them could be the flat plane crank. It's not creating as much torque. The Voodoos are very much known for not creating a lot of low end torque in particular. Then on the other one, as I said, whenever we get into torque calculations, these are the way that torque is calculated is different for all the different platforms, but this is a calculated value based generally off of air mass, volume, cylinder air mass, things like that. So I'm a little surprised. I would have expected to see the higher numbers on the GT350, but at the same time, without looking at the torque curves between the two, that may be accurate. It may be accurate that the Coyote actually generates better torque than the Voodoo, but the Voodoo, of course, makes the horsepower on the top end. And so now we can kind of look into max torque. Obviously is higher on that, and if we go into torque management, we'll probably see that in a lot of places. Max torque 406 versus 443. Driver demand, this would be interesting. Driver demand table, this is a torque table also, and it looks like it is, yeah, it's an engine torque. Sometimes you'll see axle torque. If you get big numbers in this stuff, it's an axle torque versus an engine torque. And interesting enough, we're maybe a little bit lower there. So you gotta remember, this is saying our secondary table is 29 foot-pounds lower there, but if we go down, maybe it gets a little higher. Very interesting though. Let's go out into third or fourth gear here. And so we're looking at our torque curve through here. Huh. Very peaky torque curve, but once again, that's this motor, that's this flat plane crank, that's what a lot of it's got to do with. So kind of some decent insights as to what's been going on between the Coyote versus the Voodoo. You know, I've always been interested to see what all makes up the difference. You know, we can go in a lot more phasing degrees on the Coyote versus the Voodoo. You can go out to 60 degrees retard on the cam, whereas you can only go 30 degrees on the Voodoo. Pretty much the same on the exhaust side, you know, and that's, you know, I talk a lot about variable camshafts and their worthlessness in the V8 world, but in the dual overhead cam setups like the Coyote and the Voodoo, they make all the difference in the world. That's how they're making all this power out of these 5 liters. Pushrod cams, you know, single cam cars like we've got on the Dodge and the GMs, they don't really make a difference. Anybody that wants to tell me otherwise, please hit up the comments down below. I love listening to your excuses. I can link you to a lot of different people that are professional tuners that agree wholeheartedly with me that variable camshaft timing on a pushrod V8 is there for fuel economy and emissions. It's not there for power. The little bump that you may see in the mid-range torque, you know, yeah, you can get a little bump in mid-range torque, but that's not what the variable cam is there for, and that's why we don't tune for variable cams. We get rid of them in most cases whenever we want to make real power on our setups, whereas on something like this where you have a dual overhead cam, makes all the difference in the world, and it's because you can adjust things like overlap and LSA, which we can't on a pushrod V8. So keep that in mind. But that's going to basically wrap it up for this review. Some interesting stuff on there. I hope to get to know the Mustang platform a little bit better, or the Ford platform that the Coyote's built on and the Voodoo's built on, so we can go more in depth down the road. But, you know, I wanted to start this off with something different. And, you know, the Mustang is very different for a lot of the guys who subscribe to this, because there are a lot of GM guys, but it's cool to see how different platforms work. And then it's cool to be able to take two like vehicles and see what the difference between them are. And I think as we go through this series more down the road and take a look at some things where we've got the same engine in different vehicles, we're going to see some very interesting differences from vehicle to vehicle, and a lot of that will be on how the exhaust is set up, the aggressiveness of the cam, things like that, and we can kind of see how a performance car like a Corvette, you know, is compared to maybe say a Camaro, which has the same motor for all intents and purposes, but there's some differences in there that create that extra 26 horsepower, whatever that they give the Corvette and things like that. So if you enjoy this kind of stuff, make sure hit the subscribe button, throw a like out there if you like it. If you you know, all you Chevy guys out there, don't click thumbs down on it just because I do a Ford video every once in a while. I know who you are. I'll find you. I'm just kidding. Make sure and check out the live show Thursday nights. Answer tuning questions, things like that. I'm going to get back to it. You guys know the drill. ABT, always be tuning.